My name is Warren Hoyt, and I've been a pastor and a Bible teacher for many years, and I'm continuing this series today on Christian education, the importance of it. We've looked at that and started off in the very first teaching talking about the fact that many Christians, including pastors and Christian leaders, think that there should be kind of a separation of church and school, like there is between church and state. And I want to look at that today. I want to analyze that and see how we got to that place. Because I've come to see that this is a really serious error because of things that I see in our history, but also simply because Jesus himself commanded us in the Great Commission to go into all the world and make disciples, or as I've pointed out, the Greek actually says disciple the nations, teaching them. Notice that word, teaching them, that's education, to observe everything I've commanded. In Matthew Henry's commentary, it's interesting, he says that command can be translated this way. He says this is the meaning that the Lord is expressing there. Quote, do your utmost to make the nations Christian nations. And then he goes on to say, quote, setting up a school and bringing the nations to be his scholars, that is, Christ's scholars. So education is actually discipling, and discipling is education. And we looked at how the Latin word educate means to lead out from something, to conduct someone from something to something. And so it's the idea of leading out of the darkness of ignorance toward the light and the illumination of the truth. So we looked at that in the first teaching, and then in the second I talked about how God actually discipled the first nation, the nation of Israel. He discipled them. Might not have thought about that before, but he drew them out of the darkness and the bondage in Egypt, and he brought them on their way, and started them on a journey toward the promised land where they could live as his people. And he gave them on the way the Torah, which means the law of Moses, the law of God, but it also means the instruction. And so God gave them instructions, and he commanded Moses to teach them that instruction, the principles of life. And it's so important to notice that God told Moses to write it all down on a scroll, and they were to keep it with them everywhere. And so that is what caused God's first people, the nation of Israel, to get the title of being the people of the book. They were called the people of the book of God. And as Christians, folks, we obviously are now the new people of God, including Jews and Gentiles. And we should also strive to be people of the book, God's book. And so you can't avoid the importance of education. It's essential. And I'm not talking here about just sort of a basic catechism for new believers. I'm talking about a thoroughgoing education that is for all ages and all kinds of situations. Now, in the last teaching, I looked at how the Christian movement spread into Western Europe. It's kind of interesting how it went from east to west. And it seems that on the continent of Europe is where Christianity had its greatest impact. And it's what really created Western civilization. Christianity did. And of course, when I say that, some people hate the idea of Western civilization today, and they speak against it. Oh, it's evil. They were imperialists. They exploited the other nations of the world. And so there's a negative connotation about Western civilization. But when I speak of it, I'm talking about the negative, not the negatives, but the positives. Look, and I'm going to talk about this in another teaching, but there are negatives to human beings. So what are you going to do? Annihilate human beings and say there's no good in them? No, there were negative things about Western civilization, wrong turns that the people took. But there is a lot that's positive. And what I'm trying to illustrate and point out is that all that's positive came from one source, and it was Christianity. There's a guy named Tom Holland. I'm not sure if he's agnostic today or atheist, But he wrote a book called Dominion, and I heard about it, so I read it. It's quite a thick book. And I read the book, and he admits in the introduction to that book that he kind of turned away from the faith that he had as a younger person, and he was kind of against the idea of, like I say, Western civilization, Christianity, molding Western civilization. He didn't want to accept that. But finally, he came to the place, and he wrote this book showing how it's absolutely inescapable. Christianity molded Western civilization. It created it. In 2017, I went with my daughter and some other of my family to a place called Little Europe. It's in Brussels. And we went there, and it was interesting. It's like a little theme park, and they have like, this is France, and this is Britain, and this is Germany, and so on. But I was interested to find that in one pavilion where you had these different plaques on the walls, reading them, and one said that Western Europe was created by Christianity, was molded and shaped by Christianity. And I was just shocked by that because it's in a theme park, you know. But they just admit this openly. Only the real stringent, the real vehement atheists and all hate such things. They don't want anything like that to be said. But the Europeans themselves had it written on the wall in a theme park. And so the thing is, Europe was discipled by the Christian movement. There's always the influence of Satan too, and the influence of the flesh and so on. There's always horrors and negative things. But all that's good, all that made Europe surge ahead against the other continents is the result of Christianity. And so a large percentage of the people who first established, who first settled here in what we call the United States today, the early settlers, the colonists, they were shaped by that worldview too. And so Western Europe is what came here, not Asia, not Africa. Western Europe is what populated the United States in the beginning. And so they brought that Christian worldview, that Christian culture, that biblical understanding of things to the nation. And in this teaching, what I want to look at is how those kinds of ideas produce the fruit or the consequences that we enjoy today in the United States, and produced the most prosperous and the freest, most powerful nation in history, most educated nation in history here. It was produced by Christian education. That's kind of my thesis in this teaching. And then I want to talk a little bit at the end about how that's changed today. Now, first of all, I want to say, and I always have to say this, that I'm not in any way trying to say all the settlers were Christian or they were great men and women of God and they were saints and they came here and built a utopia and America was a paradise. By no means am I saying that. I've studied too much history. It was always a mixture. It was never just all one worldview, one mindset, and everybody wanted to build the country a certain way. No. There were always non-Christians, people of other religions and beliefs and other philosophies and so forth. And many of the people who came here were just explorers. They were people seeking fortune and fame. Some of them exploited the natives and they enslaved people and so on. All of that is absolutely inescapable. And sociologist Rodney Stark, a man who's I've read many of his books and I appreciate his contribution a lot. And he brings out the fact that the percentage of people who attended church in the early years here in the colonies is not at all what you would think. It's about 1% of the people went to church. So I'm not trying to say that America was a paradise and it was all Christian or anything like by any means. However, it's inescapable that the overall general worldview of the people who founded this country was Christian and was biblically influenced and shaped and molded. And that's so true, and there's so much evidence. It's overwhelming. And in 1892, there's a Supreme Court decision where they said the United States was a Christian nation. And so what I'm saying is, of course, there's always been Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, atheists. But the overarching mindset and philosophy that influenced this country, and I would say made this country great was the Christian influence, the biblical worldview, the Christian education. That predominantly Christian education imparted a worldview and a knowledge base that made our greatness possible. In the early years, let me just tell you briefly about how education was carried out. And there's a whole lot more on this in this book, America's Providential History by Stephen McDowell and Mark Beliles, or I don't know how you say his last name. Very good book. But just to briefly touch on it, the predominant way of educating the youth in the early years, the first couple centuries of the United States, was in the home, at least until the age of 9 or 10. You only could teach in the home. There was no other way to do it. So they were homeschooled, or they had one-room schools. We also know that many of them would have tutors come and teach their kids, and often in New England particularly, those tutors would be pastors, local pastors. They would come to homes and tutor, or they would have the kids come to the church and they would tutor them there. The reasons for this are obvious. Number one, pastors in those years were the most educated people in their town or village. That's not the way it is today. Pastors today are not respected for their education, and many don't even get educated. But in those years, pastors were the most educated people, and so they could best teach children. And secondly, pastors had a job where they ministered on Sundays and sometimes another day in the week, but they had some time there where they could do the tutoring. And so while the other people were working on the farm or in a shop or whatever, pastors could come to their homes or do it at the church and tutor them. So churches actually were often centers of education. Can you imagine? What a concept. A church being a center of education. And of course, that's what they had been in Europe. And it was also what we know happened in Israel in the early days, that the Israelites educated their children in their homes. And also their priests and their Levites educated them, and then later the rabbis in the synagogues would educate them. So the church and the home were the way of education. Some of the greatest Americans were homeschooled. One of the prime examples is John Quincy Adams. He was the 6th president, and of course he was the son of the 2nd president, John Adams. And he did eventually go to Harvard and graduate from Harvard, but he was primarily homeschooled. And the man's just phenomenal. He became a linguist. He was a lawyer. He was personal secretary to his dad, the 2nd president. And then later, he was sent as ambassador to Holland and then on a special mission to Berlin. And later, he was our ambassador to Russia and then made Secretary of State under President James Monroe. And then he eventually became president himself. And it's interesting, he's the only president I know of who, after he stepped down from the presidency, his people in Massachusetts wouldn't leave him alone. They wanted him to be their congressman. So imagine going from being president to being a congressman, but that's what he did. And in his last years, he bitterly and vehemently opposed slavery on a biblical basis. He read the Bible very diligently, and there's a lot of really neat writings by him and quotes by him about the importance of daily Bible reading. And so most of our founders and framers actually were not able to go to universities. Some did, like Jefferson, but most of them learned mostly at home and by being voracious readers. They read voraciously. Abraham Lincoln only had 1 year of formal schooling. He read all the time, though, and that's how he became a lawyer and everything else. And so there's a lot of great quotes from these people, our earlier founders and framers of the Constitution and so forth. Benjamin Franklin, by the way, he was not ever a Christian as far as we know, but there's quite a few great quotes by him about God and about prayer and things like that. It's interesting. But he said this: a nation of well-informed men who have been taught to know and value their God-given rights cannot be enslaved. It is in the region of ignorance that tyranny reigns. He knew that. The populace had to be educated. Thomas Jefferson said, educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. Isn't that something? He knew if you didn't have an educated populace, you couldn't stay free. It's amazing. And then Thomas Jefferson also said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Amazing, huh? He understood that. The early settlers, another thing to note, is that they were committed or trained in something which we would call biblical scholarship. And Stephen McDowell says that, simply put, biblical scholarship is, quote, the ability to reason from biblical principles and relate them to all of life. Not only did the early American Christians reason from the Bible, but even non-Christians were trained in this way and maintained a biblical worldview. So this is what we're saying. Not that everybody was a Christian, but they were trained to think and reason with a biblical worldview. And because of that, they were able to create the outstanding founding documents of our country, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Many speak against it today, but listen, the way they formed the government, it has lasted for 250 years, more than that, and it is outstanding among the governments of the world. Sure, it's not perfect. Sure, there had to be a civil war to finally solve the issue of slavery to some, I say finally solve, to some extent anyway. But the thing that I think we have to admit is that this is the best government that's ever been on the earth. And it was because these people were trained through biblical reasoning and biblical scholarship, and they had a biblical worldview. They knew that man was a sinner, so he had to limit his power and so forth. This is what made this country great. Now, remember, when I speak of education, I'm not speaking of just information, but rather formation of the person. Noah Webster, another great from our history, he created the first American dictionary in 1828, and it was a marvel, and it had all kinds of stuff in it about God and the Bible. But Noah Webster said this. He said, education comprises that whole series of instruction and discipline, the object of which is, listen to these four things. Number one, to enlighten the understanding. That's information. Number two, correct the temperament. That's inner formation. Three, to form the manners and habits of the young, inner formation. And number four, prepare them to be useful in their future positions. Nowadays, we just think education is kind of the number four there, or number one and number four. You know, give us facts and then prepare us for a job, get us a job. But that's not what we're talking about. This was formation. Early education was, in America, was formation. And they viewed education as their responsibility as both parents and Christians. They took seriously verses like Deuteronomy 6, 6, and 7. And these words that I command you today will be in your heart, and you will teach them to your children. And also Ephesians 6, 4, fathers, don't provoke your children to anger or exasperate them, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction, there's that word, of the Lord. And so for the first 200 years, American education happened in the home. And the Bible was sort of the main textbook. And everything was biblically based. Later, of course, education was supplemented by tutors or schools that the parents helped to establish. The first school that we know of was built in 1636 in Boston. And so Christians in colonial America not only recognized that God required them to educate their children, but they also saw it as their responsibility to educate the general public. Because, as I've already mentioned, the Great Commission says, disciple the nations, and it says to do it by teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And as I've tried to point out over and over, folks, education always accompanies the spread of the gospel. It always does. Wycliffe in the 1300s trained a group of people that were lay people, and he called them the Lollards. And they went all around England educating people in the things of God and in other things as well. He trained a group of teachers. And the education of the common man, you know, it followed wherever the disciples went into Western Europe, as we pointed out. And then at the time of the Reformation, it followed the preaching of men like Luther and Melanchthon and Tyndale and Calvin and Butcher and all the other leaders of the Reformation. They always fomented and encouraged and established an educational institution to teach people. And the first immigrants to the United States then, some of them even came to escape the bad education. Europe started with all that greatness, but then just like here, they went astray, and some of the education was bad by the time some of our founders came over to this country, and they actually said, we don't want our kids anymore in these schools because they're being inculcated with wrong teaching. So they wanted to come here and start it over again. That's what always has to happen. Listen to this. In 1647 in Massachusetts, they actually have in writing that they passed a law that said, since they know that Satan wants to keep people in ignorance, every municipality that has at least 50 families has to establish a school for their children. Can you imagine that today? Political leaders meeting and saying, hey, look, Satan wants to keep our kids in darkness and in bondage, so we've got to have more schools to educate them and keep them from being deceived by the devil. Ha! Unheard of today, but that was in our founding. That's how they saw things. And then there's a lot we could talk about. I don't have time, but just I'll mention the different early resources that were used to educate. One of the most famous ones is the New England Primer of 1690, which came to be known as the Little New England Bible. It's considered the most influential school book in the history of American education. It was only 3 by 5 inches, and it only had 88 pages, but it was America's primary school book for most of the 18th century. More than 3 million copies were printed, and I'll show you pictures of it on the screen. It taught the alphabet by saying things like A, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and using scriptures for every letter, and it had lots of other biblical principles that it contained. And so this is the kind of firm foundation. It was this and many other books that were used and so forth and developed over the years that made America great. It was a biblical foundation. And of course, it's a well-established fact that all the major universities of early America were established with a Christian foundation, and they were established to train ministers primarily. And then later they branched out and taught other things, but they were all established to train ministers so that the pastors and all could be educated. And then, of course, the first public schools for other people were established to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it was all from a biblical worldview, a biblical base, to train children and the populace so that we could have productive citizens in the nation that could understand the principles of their government and keep them going. And it was recognized, as we've already seen from quotes from Jefferson and Franklin, that the nation's people needed to be educated in order to maintain self-government and government of the people, for the people, and by the people. In fact, there's a well-known story that when the delegates were leaving Independence Hall, where they wrestled for months to ratify and to accept the Constitution and to hammer it out, there's a story that when they were coming out, a woman came up to Benjamin Franklin and said, well, what have you given us? And he replied, a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it or preserve it. The problem is, folks, that in our day, without a people who are well educated in the principles of God, we are no longer preserving it. We're not keeping it. We're losing it. It's precisely because of this problem of education. So now I turn to the question of how did all this change? If it was so Christian-based for so many years, how and when did it change and why? And how did it get to the state where we're at today, where public education is totally secularized and actually you could say anti-Christian in the United States and in many other countries of the West, and even countries like Mexico, Uruguay. I've had some interactions with teachers there and so forth. First of all, so let's look at this just briefly. First of all, it's because we were pluralistic, but we started off pluralistic. The New England states were all Congregationalists. And then Virginia, Maryland, well, Maryland was Catholic, but then Virginia and some of the states in there, they were Anglican, which is called Episcopalian today. And then the state of Pennsylvania, of course, was started by Quakers. And so there was always some plurality there, but there were Christian groups. and there was competition and suspicion and so on. You know, if you have the Congregationalist minister come and lead a prayer in the school, then the people who aren't Congregationalists are upset and they want their guy to come next time and so on. So there's a little bit of struggle there. But in general, because schools were of the region, you know, where they were, most of the people were of the same mindset and so on. So it wasn't a big problem. Then what kind of started us down the wrong road was another man who was very active in promoting education. He's called kind of the father of American education, Horace Mann, in the early 19th century. And he really agitated and promoted education. He wanted everybody to be educated. And there's a lot of great quotes from Horace Mann, and I think he had a lot of good impact. But unfortunately, there were certain things that he did that led in a wrong direction. Probably, or maybe he didn't even know at the time what it would lead to. But he agitated for public, or what he called common schools. And so part of that was that, look, we got to get more schools, and so we need to get the government involved. And the government needs to tax people to pay for the schools, because otherwise we don't have enough money and we can't get this done. And so it's good that he promoted education, but he wanted to do it through the government and through taxation. And if you're going to tax people, then they start getting offended if they have to pay for certain kind of religious instruction. Some of them didn't believe in God, they don't want religion, and you're going to take my taxes and then you're going to teach my kids religion, and I don't believe in it, and I don't want them to learn religion. So we can understand that, right? Why they would think like that. Let's face it, in Europe, where they all came from, the different countries had national churches, and they would tax you. Like, say, if you're in Germany and you're not a Lutheran, you still have to pay taxes to support the Lutheran church. So our founders hated that, and they wanted to get away from that. And the same thing here, when Horace Mann wanted to have taxation for schools, people said, you know, pretty soon they said, hey, well, I don't want to pay taxes for the, you know, teaching some other religion I don't believe in, or some other denomination or whatever. And so you can understand that. It makes sense. But actually it was a step toward what's been called the secularization of America. Because when you start going down that road, it leads you someplace. Since most teachers and parents and people were still Christian, there was still Bible reading and prayer and such in the schools for decades after the reforms and the stuff that Horace Mann did. The changes didn't happen right away, but it started us on that path. And unfortunately, over time, this sort of a neutral, trying to be neutral toward religion, which is what Horace Mann wanted, to just stay neutral to it, have a vanilla sort of version, there's a God and everything, but we're not going to get into any specifics, that morphed into becoming rather more of a hostile view toward religion. We absolutely have to keep that out. You can't mention that, don't talk about it. And it was something that happened gradually, and basically the populace just accepted it to where today it's like you know that you just don't mention anything religious in schools. It's a taboo. You don't do it. And we just accepted it. But it didn't just happen that way, sort of in an innocent way. It also happened through deliberate effort by some people. Because there were some who saw the schools as a means to transform society. And of course, we know about that in our day. That's going on even more than ever with CRT and so forth in our universities. We know the leftists set out in a long march through the institutions to take over the institutions so that they could influence us and influence the population towards socialism, globalism, and so on. Well, the same thing happened back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, where there were those who wanted to stop all Christian influence, and they wanted to supplant that with something else. They weren't neutral toward religion. They weren't passive or innocent. They were outright hostile to it and saw it as a great threat. The main person who's responsible for this is a man named John Dewey. We all know about the Dewey Decimal System and the libraries and so on. He was a great promoter of education and a reformer of education. All that's good. You can find great quotes from him, just like Horace Mann. The problem is, a lot of people don't know, Dewey was a secular humanist. And he set out to deliberately change education and to change America through that. He introduced the concept of humanistic education as religion. And he was the first president of the American Humanist Association, and he was a signer of the first Humanist Manifesto. Later there was a second one. But in that manifesto, it actually defines humanism. By the way, there's Christian humanism. Humanism in itself is not bad, but secular humanism is the problem. He defined secular humanism as a new religion. It's in the Humanist Manifesto. And John Dewey saw Christianity not as an asset, but as a huge problem that needed to be solved. He saw Christianity as a problem. And so he wanted to get rid of every vestige of Christian teaching, biblical worldview, and he wanted to substitute and implant his religion, quote unquote, of secular humanism. Now listen, folks, they always present that as a non-religion. No, we're just the default position. It's just reason and common sense, and it's not any religion at all. We just believe in using the mind and in science and so forth. It's not a religion. But that is absolutely false, and it can be shown. I don't have time in this video, but it can be shown to be false by their own statements, things that they wrote, things that they said, and several legal cases as well have proven that it is a religion. And let me tell you what, the religion of secular humanism is what dominates the public schools of this country today and many others, and I'll get into that more next time. Here's a quote from Dewey, though, just so that you can know what kind of a guy he was and what he believed. He said, quote, "There is no God and there is no soul. Therefore, there's no need for the supports of traditional religion. Dogma and creed excluded, immutable truth is dead and buried." There is no absolute truth. There is no place for fixed natural laws or permanent moral absolutes. Sound familiar? Let me ask you, does it sound innocent? Does it sound like a neutral position? Absolutely not. And we didn't even realize what was being done. And of course, we became more pluralistic with more and more immigration. Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists. We have lots of different people here, and that's okay. It's all right. But the idea was a pluribus unum, from the many one, that we would be unified by something. And today we're not unified by anything. Anyway, be that as it may, with all the plurality and so forth, it was inevitable that eventually people would complain about the mention of religion. They don't want another religion taught to their kids and so on. And eventually, of course, a lawsuit was brought by the atheist Madeline Murray O'Hair and others. There's been many over the years. And so finally, a case was brought before the Supreme Court, and they ruled against prayer and Bible teaching in the schools in 1963. And so listen to this, folks. This is what is so important, I think. As a result of all this stuff, most people in America today have actually been raised with the idea that religion is a function. I'm sorry, not religion, that education, I got to change that word, that education is actually a function of the state. A whole lot of people believe that. And since the state mandates education, and since we obviously have a mixture of many beliefs among our people, then you can't allow any kind of mention of religion in education. There can be no mixture of state and school or church and school. And millions of people in America just accept that. It's just a given. It's absolutely true, of course. And as I said, at first it happened for good reasons, because we were plural and such, and the government's taxing people, and so you can't, force people to pay taxes for religion they don't agree with. And it also seemed like a great idea at the time. This Horace Mann, he's promoting more education. We need our kids to be educated. And hey, it's a big country now. We can't handle all this. It's a lot of work and hassle to do it. So wouldn't it be better if the government got involved? The government's big, and they can tax, and they can raise money, and they can do it, and also they can regulate it and make it uniform throughout the country. Won't that be great? Won't that be better? Except that, folks, what happens whenever a government, our government, takes over something? Have you noticed? I've been in former Soviet countries and stuff, and the way people treat you there's no customer service because nobody has to be nice, and nothing's painted and nothing's fixed, and there's no money and there's no initiative and there's no creativity and there's nothing pretty. It's all gray. When government takes over, now listen, government has its place, and that's a whole nother subject for another time, but government's supposed to provide for the common defense and regulate interstate trade and a few other things like that. But when they go, we can't raise an army. We can't, private citizens, we can't do stuff like that. Government has to do it. But folks, just about anything else you can think of, when the government does it, they don't do it as well. Can government handle business as well as the private sector? I don't think so. What about Amtrak? What about the Postal Service? Can government legislate morality or foster spirituality or things like that? No. How's government doing with health care? You think government does it as well with the millions of bureaucrats who are involved in all the health care, structure and infrastructure and all that today? Do you think they get as good a treatment to patients and doctors and all as it could be done in a private way? Folks, it's not the case. And government cannot run public education well either. They're not doing it. Not only is that true, they're inefficient and ineffective. They don't do it well. But also, they have a religion there that we don't want. And the fact is, you can't take religion out of education. You can't. Somebody has said, I don't know who, but all education is religious by nature. Some of you might scoff and say, what? That's not true. No, listen. Even what you teach in history, you choose certain things that you emphasize and you see it in a certain way. Why? Because of a worldview you have. So all education by nature is religious. It teaches people some sort of philosophy, some sort of worldview, a sense of values, and even a perspective on things like history and science. And so you can't take religion out of education. And even though the government runs it, you can't. What you have is, especially when you have activists like John Dewey, what you have is some people who set out to deliberately substitute their religion for our religion. He wanted to put secular humanism in the place of what he called, quote, the rotting corpse of Christianity, unquote. And he said so in his speeches and his writings. So our system of education today in America is still quite religious. It's just that today the religion isn't Christianity anymore. It's secular humanism, and there's a lot we could talk about that. But it teaches that man is the center, our own reason decides what's right and wrong. There is no God to whom we must give account, and the state, religion, and the teachers' unions, I might add, are actually against the teaching of the Word of God. In their writings, they openly said, the humanists did, that they had to change the people's values because the Christian values that they had were unacceptable. They've come to supplant the truth of God. And the most surprising thing to me as I've come to learn about these things is how we Christians, we didn't see it, or we didn't want to see it, or we didn't pay attention. We didn't want to fight. We didn't want any conflict. So we let them do this. We didn't want to have to raise the money. You know how hard it is in churches when they have a Christian school. You have to be raising money all the time, and you have to be involved as parents, and it's a lot of work. And so wouldn't it be better to have the government do it? And so just like so many other things, if somebody else says they'll do it, we just said, okay, you do it. We'll watch TV. And so as Christians, we've ended up accepting a very unbiblical concept and system of education. And I submit to you that it's a system that's ruining our country. And it's ruining our society. It is not producing good results. Not like the results we had when our country had a biblical worldview and a biblical foundation for education. I say to you, it's time that we understand our mistake. Come to our senses. We need to be woke, right? And understand what's happened and begin to rise up and take back our responsibility to educate our children first and foremost, but also to educate our whole society. And I'll talk more about that next time. Till then, may the Lord richly bless you.